I bet you the guy who mixed it also plays the French horn because he was like, yo, let's turn that horn up, dog. The thing sounds good.
Welcome to another episode of 1001 Album Complaints, the show where lifelong friends, musicians, and above all fans of music get together and tell the backstory on some of the most influential albums of all time as chronicled in Robert Dimery's book, 1001 Albums You Must Hear Before You Die. Now, if you're not super familiar with today's album, worry not. We've done the research. We shall be your guides. We are fully qualified to break this album down to its component parts while relating exactly how it got made. And along the way, we're going to play clips. We're going to dissect a handful of specific songs. And my friends, perhaps the title should have clued you in. We're going to complain. You see, we're musicians ourselves. We understand how difficult it is to make truly great art. And we come from a place of love and respect for the craft of music making. But we also love to poke fun, to laugh about the details, to nitpick, to crack jokes. So fair warning for any super fans of this band, although I'm sure you're all dead by now. We shan't be treating this or any band with any particular reverence. Instead, we aim to entertain while we inform you about the truly fascinating story of tonight's album. And at the end of all that tomfoolery, we're going to vote on whether or not you really needed to hear this album before you died. My name is Rob. I'm a songwriter. I'm a performer. I'm a music producer whose work is very unlikely to ever be included on such an esteemed list as the 1001. So instead, I decided to host a podcast about it, and here we are. Now, tonight, we are discussing a band that Marge Simpson's psychiatrist once insisted weren't about the music, Marge. They were about rebellion, about political and social upheaval. That was some small comfort to a young Marge getting bullied at school for her love of, that's right, the Monkees. We're going to get right into the music key, have an idea of what decade and what era and what style of music we're in. We're going to go around and introduce our panelists for the evening by way of an exceptionally mean tweet-length review, and I am going to throw it first over to Tom.
Thank you, Rob. You know, there was an old Dave Chappelle joke about how famous Bill Clinton was because somebody gave him a blowjob and then they became famous. I guess that Robert Dimery is insisting here that the Beatles were so essential that a Beatles knockoff cash grab also then becomes essential. I can't sign on for it personally, but we're going to explore why he thinks that in this episode.
Nice. Let's move it right on down the line. Next up will be Marty.
What up? If you put the entire Beatles catalog into AI and turn the shit knob up to 5, this is what comes out.
The good old shit knob.
Oh, man.
Nicely done. We're going to kick it next to Phil.
Yeah, so people have a tendency to like things that are similar. You know, if you like Seinfeld, you should like Curb Your Enthusiasm. If you like Terminator, you probably like Predator or Total Recall. You think that analogy would hold up when comparing musical acts? You might think, you know, the Beatles, the Monkees. Unfortunately, Demo Tape, also known as Headquarters by the Monkees, is more akin to a Cheers spinoff that isn't Frasier about Diane or Cliff Clavin or the inner workings of the U.S. Postal Service.
Wow.
Wow. The second Cheers spinoff that we never got, sadly. Thank you very much for those. It sounds like it's going to be a rough night for our friends in the Monkees. I am Rob. Again, I'm here to walk us down Monkees Lane and tell this story. And here is my tweet-length review of Headquarters. Drunk on newfound fame and determined to prove the entire hip world, let's face it, correct, the Monkees head into the studio to painstakingly churn out the watered-down, completely edge-free Bush League Beatles material that is their birthright.
Ooh, this is rough. This is a rough week, I got to be honest. None of these songs were offensive.
Yes.
Or anything like that. They're fine.
They're fine. I know. Well, let me set the stage briefly, and then I would love to get into more of your general impressions. I do feel like this is one of those instances where I find the story of this band pretty fascinating. I think you all will find a lot to relate to within it as well. And so I wanted to like this music. I agree it's agreeable. It's amiable. It's easy to listen to, but it does sound a lot like a demo tape. And in a way, that's what it is. It's a young band who hasn't really figured out how to be a band yet. That's the context in which it should be taken. And so although I grew to have a lot more sympathy for the band and their predicament as I learned about the story, I am definitely questioning the essentialness of this light and airy 60s pop music.
There's something familiar about this band, and it's because I watched their TV show as a kid, even though it was way before my time.
Totally.
Actually, Phil, in your younger days, I feel like you would have made a good monkey. You could have been like the fifth monkey.
That's a real intense backhanded compliment. Thank you.
Nobody's out there being like, I was the fifth monkey. It's going to lunch on that one.
Well, since you brought it up, I wanted to mention the show right off the bat too, because I watched the show as well when I was young, and that might seem weird to viewers who don't know. Our generation exists in this weird time where the Monkees even though the show originally aired in the late 60s for only 2 years, it had a weird resurgence in the late 80s and started getting played first on MTV and then some other channels. And so I watched pretty much all the episodes when I was a kid, and one of the things I realized, I watched a couple this week as well, it's charming, it's fun, and I was thinking back, it probably influenced a lot of my thinking on what it meant to be a band and what it was like to be in a band with your friends, and it's kind of goofy. And
definitely in my 7, 8, 9-year-old life where I was watching Monkees reruns on Nick at Night or wherever the hell they ran, adjacent to old Adam West Batman, there was something about the Monkees and Scooby-Doo that seemed like the same to me.
Right, because they're always going on adventures. They would be in Mexico in a 1950s saloon, getting into it with some scarred up gunsman.
And then they'd be like, Daydream Believer, 2, 3, 4, Yeah.
And we're going to learn about it, but the show was also quite strange and sort of subversive in what chances it took and how it was willing to break the fourth wall. And it was, although it was certainly influenced by the Beatles and Hard Day's Night, playing off a lot of those things, it was semi-shocking to an American audience at the time in 1966 when it premiered. They're using a lot of avant-garde film techniques, or what was considered avant-garde at the time.
I will say I have never watched the Monkees. Not a thing in my house growing up. I don't know, maybe my parents were just never into it. They didn't like music generally, so it wasn't like I got a whole lot of the Monkees pushed down on me. But I had the impression, listening to this album, that this was made for mass market appeal. And by that, I mean inoffensive to everybody, but didn't seem to take chances. And I equated that back to, well, they came from a TV show, which is trying to have mass market appeal and not taking chances. It sounds like maybe I was wrong about that the TV show really was taking a lot of chances. But this, to me, seemed like the sitcom version of an album, which is just kind of forgettable. It's easy, and it's not swinging for the fences.
Right. I think there's an element of taking the fame of the TV show and doing the next. It's almost an obvious next step.
Yeah.
I don't think that's quite true, as we're going to learn in the story, but there are some elements of that. And ultimately, I did walk away with much more appreciation for the music. I should be clear. I watched the TV show. It wasn't on in prime time. I feel like it was on after school.
Yeah, definitely. It was on at 3:30 on TBS or TNT or something. After Gilligan's Island, or maybe around Gilligan's Island.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. It was aimed at school children, and I just stumbled upon it. Certainly nothing my parents did, and I wasn't familiar with the music particularly other than through the show. So that's just an interesting artifact of our childhood. I don't think modern kids have watched the Monkees, certainly. But I'm really excited to get into the backstory here. So let's maybe segue into the background. And I want to be able to defend this band to a certain extent because of the way they came at this and what they were trying to do, even though I am also hesitant to fully endorse it. I'm with you guys on that, but I did learn a lot that I think is interesting and contextual.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I initially thought before I started reading about the band that it was some producer in Hollywood was like, oh, the Beatles are famous. I'm going to go hand select, for a guy with a hat, a ladies' man, a guy that looks like the kid from Stranger Things, and the other guy, and
Quite a motley crew there.
right. I mean, as I think you're going to say, it's not really like that.
It is partially like that.
Partially,
It started like that more.
It started like that. So let's get into it because it's a bit of a long story and I want you guys to keep jumping in. But I do think it's a really interesting story. So ultimately, it is a story about a marketing idea. I would argue a damn good one that outgrew the box originally designed for it. It's a manufactured phenomenon, right, that worked almost too well. It created a bit of a monster from which everyone involved seemed to want to distance themselves within only a couple of years. And lastly, I think most importantly, it's about 4 young guys who took a job that sounded exciting and cool and didn't quite realize what they were signing up for. So for this week's research, I read some of Michael Nesmith's memoir called Infinite Tuesday, but when I realized he wasn't really going to talk much about the Monkees, I gave it up and I moved on to monkey business.
Wait, what the hell else does he have to talk about?
Marty, we're going to get into it, but he's by far the most difficult monkey. And I think the record proves that, the biographical record. No, actually, he had a fairly robust career after the Monkees, but it did seem odd that he was avoiding it. So I read a more straightforward accounting of the band's history called Monkey Business by an author called Eric Lefkowitz. So as we've alluded to, this is strange in and of itself, right? The Monkees started as a television show pitch. 2 producers, Bob Rafelson and Bert Schneider, they're the producers behind this idea, and their thinking is, Beatles are popular, obviously. Hard Day's Night is a big hit. We should do a show about young musicians living together, trying to make it, and at the same time, we should be cross-marketing or cross-promoting the group with singles written and recorded by pros. And in this way, we'll create a pop group phenomenon, whole cloth, and it's really the first of its kind. It's kind of a brilliant idea, really. The industry is young enough.
It is. It is a good idea, for sure.
It's much more easy at that time to force feed the record-buying populace what they're going to consume, and then you combine it with this TV show that's in everyone's house every week, and that really, turns out that was really effective at selling records. So hats off on the concept. So henceforth, I will be calling these producers Raybert. That was what they referred to their partnership as, their production company. But it's 2 guys that are really the masterminds behind this, called Rafelson and Bert Schneider. Raybert. Once the idea gets a studio backer, they have a very short amount of time to do quite a lot of things. And I think that's going to be a theme here, is a lot of this happens so fast. I mean, some of this is just when we look back on the 60s and how fast music got turned around and how many albums bands produced, it always feels like it's going at such a fast clip. I would say in this scenario, even more so, because they're doing multiple things at once very quickly. They have to write the show. They have to cast the show. They have to write the music. They have to produce the music. All this has to be happening simultaneously, and that becomes a hallmark of how they produce the show going forward. So, of course, it begins with auditions, an open casting call. 437 young guys come in with hopes of being a part of this. Now, in a moment, we're going to talk through the actual 4 members who got the job and became the Monkees, but I was able to find several notables who were also a part of that audition class that I wanted to share with you guys. Harry Nilsson, singer-songwriter, auditioned for the Monkees.
Oh, wow.
Paul Williams, the songwriter who wrote We've Only Just Begun from our Carpenters episode 122, as well as the Rainbow Connection, auditioned.
Interesting.
The dude who wrote Monster Mash auditioned.
Oh, God, that guy.
Wow. And finally, a man named Stephen Stills.
Huh.
In fact, the producers liked Steven, but they told him they wanted someone better looking and less talented musically. So he ends up recommending a friend of his that everyone in their circle in Greenwich Village says looks like him. And that guy's name is Peter Tork.
Interesting. He's like, Peter, you're slightly less talented than I am. How about you go and audition for this band?
I mean, yeah, if Stephen Stills' career, he went, with this show instead of, had he been in Crosby, Stills and Nash at that time? Probably
No,
not.
this would be pre-Buffalo Springfield.
Oh,
even.
man. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that would have been a different look for him.
Pro move.
And let me just throw this out now, because it's something I find it hard to grasp when we're talking about music from the 60s. But this is really early in the change of the culture over. I mean, the show premieres in 1966. But even this record we're talking about, which is their third record, it's coming out in a pre-Sgt. Pepper's, pre-Are You Experienced universe. Like, a lot happened fast, and we kind of tend to bunch it together and call it the 60s in our brains. It was still a fairly innocent time, is what I want to tell you. So let's talk about the guys that did get the job, the four Monkees. One guy's name is Mike Nesmith. He was born in 1942 in Texas to a family of Christian scientists. His parents got divorced pretty young. He stayed with his mom. He was really close to her through her life and his life. And audience members might know this, but his mom invented something called liquid paper, aka whiteout, when he was 13 years old. She then built a business up over the years, ended up selling it to Gillette for $48 million in 1979.
$48 million.
In what year?
Jesus.
She founded it in the 50s. She built the company and she sold it in 1979 for $48 million.
He didn't need a job.
He did not need a job. He was basically well off from a relatively early age. She founded the company when he was 13. She actually worked with his chemistry teacher at school to make this formulation, which was for secretaries using typewriters. I hope we all know what whiteout is that are listening to this, but it helps you correct mistakes.
It's fun to sniff a lot of.
Right. So he was doing pretty well, but this is an interesting factoid, right? Now, his story was that he had got his girlfriend pregnant and he moved away from Texas at 20 to try his hand as a folk musician in LA. We're talking 1962 era. Second guy that gets cast is Peter Torkelson, aka Peter Tork. Born the same year, 1942. He grew up in Connecticut. He was working as a folk musician in Greenwich Village at the time. As I mentioned, a real scenester. He plays some guitar, he plays some piano, he played the banjo. And he was one of these kids that went to Greenwich Village because of Bob Dylan, pretty much, and knew everybody there. And that's how he knew Stephen Stills. He knew guys like Roger McGuinn, Before the Birds, all that kind of stuff.
And then just sold the fuck out immediately. First opportunity. It's like, oh yeah, no. Bob Dylan's my hero, but how about you write me some bubblegum pop songs?
We're gonna get to that. So second, I do think these guys got a little caught up by the machine, but fair enough, right? Third guy is named George Michael Dolans. He goes by Mickey. He's a little younger. He's born in 1945 in LA. He's a child actor. As a little kid, he's an actor. His dad's an actor too. He's in a bunch of movies and TV in the 40s and 50s. So he kind of comes from that tradition. Not a musician, but he was singing in bands as a teenager when they found him. So he was an experienced singer, but did not play any instruments. And the last guy is Davy Jones. Born 1945, grew up in Manchester. So that makes him the youngest, or I guess him and Mickey are the younger of the two. 3 years, kind of means a lot when you're 20 years old. An interesting fact about David Jones, aka Davy Jones, he was a Broadway star. So Oliver, the musical, premieres in 1960 in London. It's hugely successful. It's one of the first big London musical productions. It runs for 3 years. Davy Jones at that time in the early days is part of a rotating cast of young actors playing some of the child roles in that. By the way, also cycling in at that time as an actor, a young Phil Collins.
No.
But anyway, by the time it actually makes it to Broadway in 1963, Davy is cast as the Artful Dodger. He's Tony nominated. It's a huge hit. They get booked on an American TV show called Ed Sullivan. And guess what night they go on?
The night the Beatles were on?
The same night that the Beatles were on Ed Sullivan, Davy Jones was there performing as part of the Oliver Broadway show. So he kind of already was out there. Again, not really a musician, but a singer established in show business. He actually got to skip the audition process entirely. And we should mention he's the only one that's British, right? I mentioned that he grew up in Manchester and was on the stage in London. The rest of the three guys are American, obviously. So now the production has its actors. They purposely chose the group based on a couple parameters, looks and charm, of course, but also they have some musical leanings. Really they picked two musicians who they think they could make into decent actors and two actors who they think could effectively pretend to be musicians. So they are having that some sense of balance there, right? Next up, they got to quickly, right after the casting, they want to record music for the pilot. And here's where things start to get or go a little awry. So musicians, the two musicians of the group, Mike Nesmith and Peter Tork, they get to the studio session, which they're invited to, assuming there'll be some kind of part of the recording. But they arrive to realize that everything's already been recorded. They want exactly zero input from them. They really just want the four guys there to test out who's going to be the lead singer on the very first single, which is Last Train to Clarksville. Turns out it's Mickey Dolenz, who actually I think is a terrific singer and should deserve a little more credit. But right off the bat, Torque and Nesmith, they're kind of being shuffled through this process. They have some vague promises of musical input that are never really fulfilled. Keep in mind, these are like 20, 21, 22-year-old kids at that point who are just on a fast-moving conveyor belt. And the casting took longer than usual, so they really had to rush through to getting a song produced and getting the pilot produced very quickly. So they didn't have a lot of time to think, right? Part of it's logistics.
I will say this, though. It wasn't that uncommon. We've talked about it many times, that the band would show up and they'd be like, no, we got better players to record your stuff.
Yeah, that's a great point.
They shouldn't have been that surprised or pissed off about it. It's like kind of everybody was doing that at that period of time.
It's true, and that's the irony, and we're going to get to kind of the backlash they really experienced, where people were egging them on the streets because they didn't play their instruments or write their songs, and yet...
Appropriate. Seems like the right move.
That was a really common scenario at the time, right?
You guys don't carry eggs? Just in case.
I was egging Taylor Swift like a week ago.
Yeah.
The president make the news.
So to undergo this process, right, they have to have a single ready. They have to shoot a pilot. They have to have it ready to go. The songs themselves are in the show every week. And so if they're going to continue to produce the show, they have to constantly be making new recordings, right? So it's a bit of a factory approach, perhaps not uncommon now when we think about how pop music is made. But at the time, it was a little... maybe slightly more odd. So they had hired some songwriters. The main pair were called Boyce and Hart. They were songwriters under contract with the studio. Then they ended up writing a bunch of the big hits, including Last Train to Clarksville. But because this is a big studio-backed project, they actually had lots of money, and they had access to the Brill building of talent. So you had people like Carole King and Jerry Goffin writing for the Monkees. You had Neil Diamond writing for the Monkees. So, okay, they're slightly disappointed, but like you said, it's kind of par for the course. They roll with it. Now, as Marty alluded to, each four was given a different personality to portray. Dolenz is supposed to be the funny one. Nesmith is the smart and serious one. Torque is the naive one. Jones is the cute one. And they are definitely loosely based on the people themselves, but also on the Beatles, right?
Marty, which one would I be?
You'd be like the mischievous one.
Okay, thanks.
Like
Okay.
pranking them, the rest of them.
They cast Peter Tork well because he looks like a dumb motherfucker, I gotta say. He's supposed to be the gullible one. He does not look like a smart man.
So that's funny because they said that it did fit with their personalities except for Torque, who was actually the complete opposite of the person he played. He was the most into hippie ideals. He was the most intellectual, philosophical of them. And so he was really playing against type. Interesting. And also, we're going to get to some anecdotes, but he was a total fucking scenester, dude. He knew everybody. He loved to party. I mean, there's way more drugs and sex in this story than I think I was expecting. And Torque is at the forefront of that for sure.
Just for the record, Peter Tork, great porn star name.
That's good. Yeah.
So Raybert, the producers, they had this really interesting vision that the show itself would use a lot of, as I mentioned before, what were considered at the time avant-garde film techniques. A lot of improv, quick cuts, sped up film, breaking the fourth wall. The series was pioneering in that way. It almost, at the time, it read a little more like a French art film than a standard TV show. And in addition to that, they decided, right, as we've alluded to include a bunch of these semi-random cuts to just musical clips inside the episode, where the recordings they produced got played, the band lip-synced or danced around or ran around. And in retrospect, these vignettes kind of look like a precursor to MTV music videos. But of course, they were also mirroring some of the Beatles' forays into movie making and some of the little promotional videos the Beatles made on some of their singles. But still, putting this stuff on network TV, and honestly, even if you watch the Monkees now, it still reads as like kind of weird, quirky, and subversive. It actually kind of holds up decently.
That was going to be my question, because you're just, the way that you're describing it is like, I'm going to walk in and it's going to be, black and white and some guy smoking a cigarette talking about, like you describe it like French avant-garde stuff. I think something probably different than bubblegum pop.
No, like Phil said, it's a lot like Scooby-Doo. I think that was a good comparison.
Scooby-Doo also did break out the band sometimes, and they'd have some songs in the middle episodes.
Kiss would just pop out of nowhere.
Yeah.
It's not black and white cigarette smoking French new wave stuff, but it's more slapstick and taking chances and talking to the camera and just weirdness. And so even though not all the comedy holds up, there are some elements of it that are just still, the guys themselves are pretty darn charming, I would say still.
The episode I watched yesterday, their car broke down in Mexico, and they had to come up with some money to fix it. And so, like, the guy at this saloon made them play nonstop live music until they had enough money to afford their car repair.
That's exactly what happens when you break down in Mexico.
Sing.
So the producers hire a young director, help them practice improv, and the Monkees quickly realize that one of them has to learn drums, or at least enough to fake it, right? So they draw straws, and Mickey volunteers and starts right in and approaches it just like an actor learning lines. And we know from experience, right, that is hard to do.
Yeah. It's probably like easy enough to fake the hands, because with drumming, it's the feet. The feet are the hard things in drumming for me personally. It's probably easy to fake the hands and just like, I just don't feel my feet. I'm not doing the kick drum on the rhythm, but I can kind of just fake it on the, on the hi-hat and the snare drum.
Yeah, it's probably the easiest instrument, in my opinion, to learn. There's something natural about it.
Well, it's intuitive, but I think what we're going to see is that it's the hardest one to play well, perhaps, or one of the harder ones to play well, because when they actually have to start performing, or even recording, right, for this record, Mickey's going to have a really hard time keeping tempo, not making mistakes, and those kinds of things tend to be learned over a much longer period of time.
I feel like in a band, you can have a shitty bass player, you can have a shitty rhythm guitar player, you cannot have a shitty drummer. If you have a shitty drummer, everybody knows.
I don't know. Have you ever seen Metallica?
He's not a good drummer, but he's not a shitty drummer.
No, he's got a good point, though. Hetfield just brings it so hard that Lars can kind of just track to him.
Shots fired. So the show premieres September 1966. Again, all this is just happening really fast. They're cast 2 months before that. They make they make Last Train to Clarksville. They release it before the show even premieres, and then the show premieres. And I should mention, we said that the Monkees was back on television in the 80s after a long time of being off it. I think that was partly due to the 20th anniversary of the band in 1986 coming around, and which created some newly reformed reunion touring. And it was also MTV specifically, who was still pretty new at the time as a network. They were looking for angles, and they agreed to start airing it. They aired a Monkees marathon. It did well, and then after that, they aired it continually, and other networks picked it up. So kind of just a coincidence, right? So we mentioned that the single Last Train to Clarksville hits the radio before the pilot even premieres, or rather the first episode. It's a hit. Payola, let's be honest, it was big in these days. You could pay DJs to play the song, and they definitely did that. That said, I think Last Train to Clarksville is a pretty solid song. It kind of sounds like Paperback Writer Part 2, but it works.
It's catchy, which I think that's what they're going for, is catchy, right?
I like Daydream Believer a lot. Like, I think that's just like a hit.
That comes much later, though, right?
That's later. That's closer to when this record was released, which is actually really only about a year later. Things move really fast in this universe, as I mentioned. But just in case you don't know what Last Train drops, people watch it. It's a hit, which brings us to our absolutely undisputed, never, ever argued about behind the scenes favorite segment, By the Numbers. First number I want to throw out at you guys, 75 million. That is the Monkees record sales worldwide.
Wow.
They have a much larger catalog than I was expecting.
Yeah.
They have a lot.
They really
of
do.
records.
And to be clear, that's not Beatles level sales, of course, but it puts them in the company of artists like Aretha Franklin or Nirvana or The Police. They've sold a lot of records over the years.
Well, and they put out between 1966, late 1966, because it was like October was their first, of 66 was their first album was released, and 1970, they put out 9 albums in that span of time. That's a lot of material.
It's like Zappa.
We're going to get to that shortly because, they put out material quickly. And part of it was this factory approach. And part of it was because they just had to record so much material because they were putting on a show every week that needed new produced songs to be in it. That's kind of a strange situation, right? Next number I want to throw out, speaking of Monkees making money, 100 million. That's the merchandise sales per year during their peak in this late 60s period. We're talking lunch boxes, book bags, everything under the sun was getting sold.
Davy Jones, sex dolls.
Yeah, were they making more money than the Beatles?
No, because they didn't have a part of things like merchandise. So this is
Gotcha.
part of what's so discontent, right? If they're not writing the songs, they're paid as actors on the show.
Yeah.
And eventually they would get paid to tour, which is where a lot of artists make their money. And eventually they would get some writing credits, right? And have some minor hits that way and get money that way. But at this point, they're probably not cut in on the merchandising. I don't know all the details of their deal, but they're plug and plays, right? That are being used by this studio.
Yeah, sure. Work for hire, really.
Exactly.
But I mean, Peter Tork is going to do like a bunch of blow in the clubs and bang random chicks, so he's probably pretty happy about that.
Exactly. Next number, and this is wild, 4. That's the number of consecutive albums that they put out to hit number 1 on Billboard. That includes Headquarters, tonight's album, and the follow-up to Headquarters. And not only that, they were all number 1s in 1967.
Wait. So you're saying that they had 4 number 1 albums in 1967?
That is correct.
What constitutes number 1 for a week? Or
Billboard publishes an album chart every week since 1955 based on sales and other data about radio play, and they're trying to amalgamate all different kinds of things. I don't know. It's something Billboard does.
And it's based on data. It's not like John Billboard is like picking on his own.
It's a black box as to exactly what they do, but it is considered the most steady stream of an amalgamation of what it means to be popular. So no, I don't think it was being bought. But to be clear how that happened, they started 67 on top because their debut had come out in 66, shortly after the show premiered, right? So that was number 1 at the beginning of 1967. Then they knocked themselves out of the top spot when their second album got released. Then there's a little break in the spring. Then Headquarters was number 1 in June of that year. And by year's end, their 4th album was a number 1 as well. And I should point out, no other artist has ever done this. The Beatles and Elvis each had 3 in a given year. Whitney had 4 in a row in the 80s, but never within a year's span. So this was a record-selling powerhouse for a minute there.
Can you tell me the name of that 4th album of theirs? Because it's fucking terrible.
I don't have that handy. Do you have it handy, Tom?
Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, and Jones Limited.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
It's really bad.
Good.
Pretty goofy. Okay, now look, I should point out here that it has been widely reported that the Monkees outsold the Beatles and the Stones combined in 1967. But after some digging, it appears that is a complete fabrication that Mike Nesmith told a reporter in the 70s and has since been reprinted many times as fact. So, like I said, the Monkees released 3 records that year. The Beatles only released 2. We're talking about 1967, which is the year Headquarters came out. Beatles released 2 in that year. That was Sgt. Pepper's and Magical Mystery Tour. The Stones released 2 as well. They were kind of at a creative ebb with Satanic Majesty in between the buttons. I tried my damnedest to find the real sales data to really disprove this widely reported, I think, wrong fact. But I have failed you, audience. But I can say with some confidence that the Monkees did not outsell the Beatles this year, and they were almost certainly not way above them, as is often reported.
Thank God.
Okay, but all that fame does not last, nor does it carry over always to weird experimental vanity projects. So the next number I have for you is 16,000, which is what the Monkees movie Head, released in 1968, just 1 year after this crazy victory lap, what that grossed at the box office.
$16,000?
$16,000. By contrast, it cost $750,000 to make.
Nice.
So we will touch on Head again before the show is through.
Has anyone seen this movie?
I've seen it, and we will get to it. We will get to it. But
So did you have to buy it?
no, I saw it on YouTube.
Okay. I was going to say, you could have like materially added to its box office gross if you spent $5 on it or something
Indeed,
like that.
and they need it. But speaking of budgets, this show is a labor of love. We pour hours upon hours of our time into it every week, trying to bring you beautiful people entertainment and information. And of course, we bring all this to you for free, and we love doing it. And we're so grateful that you are listening to the sounds of our voices today. And if you want to support us and let us feel the love, there's a few simple things you can do. They don't cost anything, and they are ever so simple. 1, you can join our mailing list. There's a link in the show notes where you can enter your email address and it's done. Or anytime you can just drop us an email about any old thing. It doesn't have to be clever. It simply lets us know to add your email address to our growing community. We'll email you around once every other month, let you know what's happening with the show, how you can vote on what we cover on the show, or maybe submit your own tweet-length reviews. We'd very, very much appreciate it. It really mean a lot. If you've already done that, you can go ahead and give us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast app, or even your second favorite. We don't mind, or both. And lastly, you could tell a friend directly. Turn them on to what we're doing. And if you don't have enough like-minded friends, well, that's where our totally free Patreon community comes in. Join up for free, participate in the comment threads with other fans, continue the conversation over there. Regardless, however you choose to support the show, we thank you sincerely. Okay, now back to our story of the Monkees headquarters. So on the insane popularity of this phenomenon, they talk about, if you're wondering why, right? They talk about the mania gap. Beatlemania had just ended. The Beatles weren't playing anymore because they had started moving on musically from pop music. And there was this perfect storm opportunity. And it should be noted that the Beatles were making weirder music at that time, in part, as they said in interviews, because they were over screaming teenagers. They wanted to change the makeup of their audiences. But the teens still wanted to scream, baby. So Ray Burt, the producers, they read the tea leaves, they pitched this idea, and it worked. It was huge, right? Now, one thing I thought was interesting I'd never heard of before is that they talked about how the Monkees created a micro-generation gap within households, a sibling gap, if you will, where the older siblings thought it was a goofy teeny bopper stuff and didn't like the Monkees, and the younger siblings, who had somewhat missed the Beatles, only a couple years past, right, absolutely loved it.
This makes sense.
Yeah, and the older siblings were right, and the younger siblings were wrong. But, you know,
I do think Tom, I have to say, like, I feel like without the show to sell the music, it is hard. I'm feeling a lot of nostalgia for the show. I don't know if Phil and Marty can comment.
Oh, yeah.
I watched the show as a kid, and like I thought it was like fun and cute, and like I didn't turn it off. Like I would enjoy watching it.
I'm not saying it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. I'm simply saying that is a big part of my understanding of this band, and rightfully so, because it is the vehicle by which they were sold to the masses. So they are charming guys, I could just assure you. So if you haven't watched the show and you don't know what the heck we're talking about, consider pulling up an episode, right? But okay, I said the show was semi-revolutionary, not just in the style that it was made, but also in its subject matter. It was showing young people with no authority figure around, which was kind of unheard of at the time. It was the very early days of the hippie counterculture and long hair, and it gave America a window into a wholesome version of that lifestyle, where the Monkees in real life were living that too, minus the wholesomeness, right? So they become famous overnight. They like to have fun. They like to hobnob with other celebrities. I have a few celebrity monkey anecdotes, right? Now, I'm just still reeling from how huge and scenestery these dudes were overall. I think that is really something I learned this week. Around this time, they talk about going to London, swing in London, late 60s. Beatles throw them a welcome party at the club. They're hanging at the club with Dusty Springfield, the Beatles, Clapton, Beck. They'd all do acid. Like, best scenario you could imagine.
plus Clapton.
Plus Clapton.
Yeah, to be welcomed into the inner circle as kind of a bunch of hacky type people is pretty awesome.
But I think that's the thing I want to get across is, yes, they were more than accepted by people like the Beatles and by other musicians because they themselves were cool guys. And it was acknowledged that what they were doing was kind of bubblegum and lame. And in fact, the Monkees quickly tired of repping that kind of music because they had no hand in creating it. And they didn't like the idea that they were even associated with it. They thought of themselves a little differently. But they were legitimate friends with the Beatles. The Beatles totally embraced them, to the point where Torque even played on George's Wonderwall, right? And in general, they were cool and they were accepted into the fraternity of cool musicians of the day. Now, Torque, as I already alluded to, he took his first big paycheck. He got himself a Playboy Mansion style place in LA where people were constantly tripping, were naked, crashed out everywhere. And he was just this like scenester du jour of LA. I heard a few things about him, and by all accounts, he was the coolest monkey. So there's a story about the Who coming into town, and they go right to Torque's place, take a bunch of drugs, and he plays them music from the Big Pink for the first time, and they're all like, their minds are blown. It said that he was friends with Stephen Stills, right? It said that Stills and Crosby's earliest jams were at this place of Torque's, this debaucherous house. The dude just knew everyone on the scene. It said that when Robert Plant first came to LA with Led Zeppelin and he really wanted to meet Neil Young, and they're like, you know, the dude you should talk to about an introduction is Peter Tork. And he did, and he got the introduction.
No shit.
So it's weird how in the sands of time, it's not really thought of that way. Plus their wholesome image outwardly, right? They actually were cool guys, at least as dudes.
I wonder how much the wholesome image played into people really liking and accepting them, because he's like, oh, here comes the fucking Monkees, yeah, with a bunch of posers. He's like, I got some fucking acid and blow, you guys want to hang out? And they're like, oh no, you're cool, man, that's awesome.
And Rob, one thing you didn't mention is that Davy Jones was a jockey.
A jockey.
That actually sort of makes sense because he's mad short, right?
He's very short. And speaking of Davy Jones, he was the one that did not engage with the counterculture. He was definitely more conservative. This created some challenges with making friends with the other guys. But again, they were so popular. Davy Jones became such a household name that another young British singer with that exact same name decided he'd have to change it to have a chance at fame. And he chose the name Bowie instead.
Oh, shit. Davy Bowie.
So now, the entire time, no one has been trying to hide the fact that this band was a manufactured phenomenon. But after this initial wave of fame, of course, there's a backlash. I mean, it's all happening quickly. Again, we're talking a couple months after the show premieres. The press starts doing stories about them not playing on their own records. The studio handles it kind of poorly. They insist the Monkees stop talking about it in the press. And that just fed the fire more, right? Now, of course, we already mentioned the irony is that this was really common at the time. Most bands did not play their instruments at that time. Their writing your own songs thing had really just started to come into prominence with Dylan and the Beatles in the last few years. But as we know from many other podcasts we've done about records from this mid to late 60s era, using studio killers was definitely the norm, not the exception, right?
Well, and we talked about this on, I can't remember which episode it was, but we had talked about how Bob Dylan and the Beatles killed the songwriter industry. I think it might have been the Elton John episode, where like that was a viable job in the early 60s to just be a songwriter who writes volume songs and gets farmed out to all these different acts. And then the cool thing became, oh, you got to do it all yourself. But that was 2-3 years in the past at this point. When we're talking about the Monkees coming out, like it's not like they were like so far behind the times. Nobody's done that since the 40s or anything like that.
Yeah, it's not a total miss. It's not a total mismatch.
Yeah. Well, and also they probably should have been like, dude, we put out an album in October 1967 and then one on 9th of January 1970. Who the fuck do you think was writing all this shit and recording it? You really think this was us? And we did 17 episodes of a TV show in this time? Like, what do you think we're doing here?
So inside the band, there's turmoil as well. They barely know each other. They've only known each other for a couple months. The show is hopping. They have this really intense schedule of studio sessions where they typically only have to sing, but still they have to attend studio sessions. They have to film the show. They have to do press, all this other stuff, right? And Nesmith is the one that really is openly hostile, like from the get-go about this arrangement. So as their star power grew, and particularly as Mike Nesmith's star power grew, that only got worse, right? It seems like Peter Tork felt the same, but he wasn't as pushy about it. Now, Mickey and Davey didn't seem like they cared too much. They didn't have a musical ego backing them up in any way. And at the same time, I think they just had a deeper appreciation of show business, right? With a capital S.
Probably also didn't have that whiteout money to fall back on when this whole thing fell apart.
That too.
You said like $48 million in the 70s, right?
That's a lot of money. It's like $1 billion.
Yeah, it's a lot of money. Yeah.
So at the same time, they're embracing the idea of becoming a real band. They had a practice space on set while they're filming that first season, and they're in between shooting. They're trying to get something going, even during this early time, right? Now, at the same time, the studio is throwing Nesmith the scraps. He's 2 of his songs that he wrote are included on what would become the first album release, which came out shortly after the show premiered, but they weren't singles. Frankly, they didn't deserve to be. And the guys didn't play on them, just sing, right? So the studio would get fairly tense. They've got product to turn out. The studio, making more records is baked into their weekly schedule. And at one point I read that Mike Nesmith actually made Carole King cry at the session.
Oh, what a dick.
What a dick. Exactly.
It's not cool. She's a national treasure.
He comes off like a real asshole, even in his own memoir, which is really saying something.
I know you're talking about like, they had these studio sessions, but they didn't have to play. All they had to do was sing. I find the studio sessions where I have to sing are by far the most taxing for me personally, by far the hardest. Playing my instrument's actually relatively easy. I feel like I can do that much more fluidly than just like bust out a great vocal performance on cue. So I could see it being stressful, especially with this breakneck pace of like, hey, we got to get like 12 good tracks in the next 3 days.
And also embarrassing to be like, we have this album, and then like they're trying to play real instruments on the side of their set, you know, and everyone around is just like, look at these assholes. They have a number one album, and they can't even get through like their easiest song.
Yeah.
Right. So as the show continues, the actors keep trying to exercise some musical control. As the last of the 22 or so episodes of season 1 are airing, the Monkees are hell-bent on making a record as a band. So into the studio they head in March of 1967 to make their third LP, which is Headquarters. So again, they met less than a year before. They started as 2 musicians and 2 non-musicians. They've been practicing, you know, the show premiered in September, and in March they go in hell-bent on making this thing by themselves.
So this is about, you would say, about a year of them playing their instruments at this point?
I would say significantly less, because they only got cast in the show, I think, in July.
Okay.
So 9 months, I would say max. Now, the 2 guys had some musical experience, had some performing experience.
Well, Rob, I'm just relating this back to our band, The Chop, where we had you and Phil, who both played guitar, James, who had just recently learned how to play the keyboards, John, who had never played any instrument ever, with the exception of like 40 Seconds in a Talent Show 10 years ago, and then me playing drums, who I had never played the drums before. And in about the same amount of time, we ended up putting an album out. It wasn't that much longer than that.
And we sold a solid 75 million copies, right?
Yeah.
Easy.
Yeah.
I'm just pointing out that my sympathy for them being like, oh, they're non-musicians and they really put in the work to do. I'm like, yeah, you know, that's your job. It's not that hard.
I think they were just a little caught up in a machine. They didn't quite know. There's fame is swirling around. That was a big factor. They had a lot of things on their mind at the time, and they're just young guys. That's all I'm trying to say.
A lot of orgies to get to, right?
Exactly. Headquarters is produced by a guy called Chip Douglas, who was a member of the Turtles and played bass on the song Happy Together. Thought that was an interesting detail. I've always liked that song as a pop song. They were, of course, inexperienced players, but we should emphasize they were inexperienced in the studio specifically. So even if you kind of know how to play your instrument, if you've never been in a studio setting, the so-called red light fever, when that thing comes on, it can be quite nerve-wracking. Not to mention there's studio killers all around. Time is money. A lot going on, right? So Peter could play banjo. Peter Tork could play banjo. He could play the piano, although he would make mistakes during takes. Mike could play rhythm guitar. He plays a couple other things on this album. Mickey could play the drums okay, because he'd been practicing for that amount of time, like we said, but his timing was quite erratic. Now, Davey plays nothing. He pretty much just sits around and occasionally contributes to vocals, but they were convinced that they had to do it themselves to prove the haters wrong, to the point where some of the songs took like 50 takes to do.
Dude, that's brutal.
It is brutal. And to be fair to them, I don't think you really hear that on the tape. It does sound pretty light and airy, but they were also stitching together fragments of takes to make full takes.
So on the show, I think Davey is always the singer, right?
No, Mickey sings the most of the hits. So Mickey is the guy they kind of picked. They do trade vocals somewhat consistently. Davey's always the one that's out in front just playing like maracas or a tambourine.
Okay.
Torque will typically be playing bass in the show. Mike Nesmith guitar and Mickey drums.
The funny thing is, as we've talked about before, tambourine's actually remarkably hard to play well. So like I wonder, like on set, it's probably fucking terrible, and he's all off time with the tambourine and stuff. You know, like the actual, you know, sound that's happening on the set must have been terrible before they piped in the real music.
Yeah, but with the thunder's low end of Torque, you know, Torque laying it down.
Yeah, exactly.
It's got a really real deep pocket there from Torque.
Yeah.
So as I said, they were totally okay with stitching together fragments of takes to make full takes, to the point where on one of the tunes, it's not on the focus list, it's called No Time Left for You. They actually gave full writing credit to the engineer because he's the one that crafted it from a series of unsuccessful takes, which was kind of a cool thing to do given how much they knew this record would inevitably sell. That guy, I'm sure, made a lot of money on that.
Nice.
That's cool.
Now, that said, they did eventually concede to a pro bass player. 3 of them in total, including the producer, Chip Douglas, play on basically all the tracks. Now, take a second to think about that. Why is the bass the only thing they conceded not to play on their own? Like, why would that be? I do not know.
Well, if you don't have a great drummer, it helps to have a bass player that's helping rhythmically with that. I would say that as somebody who did play the drums from nothing and had to be in a band very soon after starting to play the drums, when the bass player was off, I was completely fucking done. Like I fell apart every time. If there's not like somebody really helping me with the rhythm, I would fall apart every time.
I just thought it was an odd choice because they seemed really into making it themselves. They're on here playing zither, they're playing pedal steel, they're playing a bell piano, all kinds of shit. Torque even plays bass on one or two of the tracks. So I don't really get it, but yeah, your point is well felt. It's going to help that rhythm section, which is going to lay down the pocket.
They should have just had a professional drummer. That probably would have helped a whole lot.
Right, that would have helped. So despite all that, this is the height of their friendship, the height of their cooperation. A few of them looking back said it was the best time to be a Monkee as infighting kicks off shortly hereafter and never, ever lets off the gas. This is the only record that the four of them ever made collaboratively. So again, this is the only time they ever all recorded something together. Even though they continued to make records as the Monkees, they did them almost wholly separately with a cadre of studio musicians. Even the ones they would write, Nesmith would get his own studio musicians, Torque would get his own studio musicians, and they continued like that after Headquarters. But Headquarters is the one record where they're actually cooperating on stuff. So it is not a mature rock band, as we've already pointed out, but it does have some energy and some charm as an albeit already famous group kind of trying to get off the ground. It gets released in May of 1967. It actually does extremely well, as like we've already alluded to. It hits number 1 on the Billboard. We said that. It hits number 1 in Canada. It hits number 2 in the UK. It charts in Germany and Finland, Norway, Argentina. It's got legs, baby. There's only one problem. Well, there's probably a couple problems, but one big problem is another record gets released within 4 days of this one, and it's called Sgt. Pepper. Beatles are just starting to move into new kinds of ideas musically, right? And move away from their pop roots. And Sgt. Pepper's was such a huge landmark album. Of course, it overshadowed what the Monkees were doing. It made what they were doing seem old-fashioned, I think, by comparison, which fair enough, right? That said, they sold 3 million copies of this album. They stayed in the charts, competing directly with Sgt. Pepper's pretty much throughout the year. They were number 2 when Sgt. Pepper's was number 1. And we talked about subsequently released another record that made it to number 1 later in the year. They are, and I need to stress this, an unmitigated hit in terms of sales and fame. I think we've gotten that across, but they're getting taunted in the press. Even after this record comes out, they're still like, do they even play? Like, what are these guys doing? Rumors are going around. So they realize they have to tour. It's the only way to dispel these ideas. Now, the things they have going for them is that they do understand how to put on a show, a stage show. Comedy, antics, dancing, music. There's a lot of stagecraft. They have it down. They work well together. What they don't have is a tight band. They sound like a garage rock band, basically, and they're trying to reproduce their recordings. Now, get this. That summer, Mickey and Peter went to Monterey Pop as spectators, and they are amongst the earliest Americans to see Jimi Hendrix play live. And they're huge stars, right? They're used to getting what they want.
Yeah.
So they decide they want Hendrix to open for them, and he does.
Damn, really?
Big mistake.
Yes. No. Apparently, I know this is a wild story, right? Like, so Jimmy's manager really wanted it to happen. He's thinking about getting him in front of all these teenage girls, selling all these records. This is before, or Are You Experienced, I think, came out that summer, right? So it's really early in Jimi Hendrix's record-making career. Now, this is despite the fact that Jimmy had referred to the Monkees the previous year as dishwater in an interview.
I don't understand what their thinking was. It's like, we kind of sound shitty. Let's get one of the best power trios of all time to just show us up continually every time we play.
Well, it's probably just to be associated with his greatness,
They said they just wanted to watch him play every night, and they did. And they were like, this was freaking awesome and inspiring. They're touring with Hendrix. I just set the scene for you. They're touring with Hendrix in their private plane with the Monkees logo on the side. Like, this is some deep rock star stuff.
Yeah, they're probably partying on that plane, huh?
They're like, you just can't play Sgt. Pepper's on this tour at all.
I wonder if Hendrix is into heroin already at this point. Is, him and Mickey Dolenz in the back tying off or anything like that?
I'm sure they partied. I read some story about how they rented a yacht for Mitch Mitchell's birthday party in Atlanta, and they just had a wild time. There was definitely some antics, and it seems like the bands actually really got along. But unsurprisingly, perhaps, Hendrix hated it. Right, he lasted about 10 shows. He liked the Monkees themselves, as I just said, but he could not stand playing for screaming 14-year-olds because that's who was at the show. They said when Jimmy would shout Foxy in Foxy Lady, the entire audience would shout back Davy because they wanted heartthrob Davy Jones to come on.
That's a pretty big fuck you.
The truth is, no one cared that they didn't sound good. Teenager girls were screaming the entire performance, just like Beatlemania. Again, Beatlemania ends, and where does the mania go? The mania is still there. It needs an outlet, right? So they tour very successfully by any measure. They continue to make hit records. Some of the very next records they make are Pleasant Valley Sunday and Daydream Believer, which actually I think are both pretty great songs. Unfortunately, this is the time where a lot of the singles get left off of records. Like, I wish there was a better single like that to anchor this one, but okay. They have a touring career off and on until they all pass away, but the band was never united at a purpose again, right? That was due to a shared lack of musical direction, disagreements about lifestyle, drug use. At one point on the Headquarters tour, Torque punched Davy Jones in the face. He had to get stitches. Like, they were fighting. They were briefly united to make Headquarters, and they were pretty much at odds from that point
I like
on.
how as soon as they actually had to start writing music together, they all hated each other. It's like, that's like every band experience I've ever had.
Also, Davy Jones does have a pretty punchable face, I'll say.
Yeah.
So Mickey seems like the chillest of them all and was the peacemaker. And he ends up hanging out a lot with Harry Nilsson, Ringo, Keith Moon, and Alice Cooper as the founding members of the so-called Hollywood Vampires, basically a drinking club in LA. Again, they're just total scenesters, right? And in the studio, they're each doing their own songs with different sets of musicians. Okay, so I just want to touch on a couple more things about the aftermath, then we'll get into the songs. The TV show ran its course after 2 seasons, but they had a movie deal with the producers, Ray Burt, and were into doing it if it could continue on this highly experimental film trajectory that the show was going on. Now, at the same time, they were really excited to break from type, to do something completely un-Monkees, to lose their teeny bopper image. And the guy they get to help write the movie Head is a young B-movie actor, an LA seedster, and friend of the band and the producers, and his name is Jack Nicholson.
What? So bizarre.
Now, the movie's called Head, and perhaps unsurprisingly, Head is way too weird for the general public. It's a bit of a cult classic now, but it did not make the splash they wanted it to. I already mentioned the box office was really disappointing, and at that point, they're pretty much completely abandoned by the producers who put them together. Ray Burt, the producers who originally pitched the idea, right? And we can talk about the movie now for a moment. I watched it in college. I watched about half of it again this week. It's like a cross between Monty Python and Song Remains the Same. Like, it makes no sense. There's no continuous story. It's all over the place. The music is actually a little more modern and fun, more modern than this record, I think, and definitely a little more of a foot in the 70s. So it's just like, it's a weird artifact, but I don't really know if it's worth watching. However, Jack Nicholson and the producers, Ray Burt, continued to work together, and the next movie they made did a lot better, and it was called Easy Rider.
Yeah.
Easy Rider, which arguably set off a renaissance in auteur-based filmmaking in Hollywood, was funded by Monkees' success. That is monkey money, baby.
Yeah, I was wondering if it was just like a longer version of like a Monkees episode.
It's just way darker.
Way stranger. I was, right before we got on to do the show, I was watching a clip of it, and Torque like punches out a waitress in a diner, like for no reason.
Okay, wow, it's like dark.
Like, they're definitely trying to shake their image. There's violence. It's psychedelic. It's pretty bizarre. And lastly, I just wanted to mention that the studio head, we haven't mentioned his name yet. I don't think his name's important. so annoyed that his cash cow trained seal pop group wasn't doing what it was told anymore, he decided to try again, this time with cartoon characters. The result is a band called the Archies.
Oh, yeah.
Whose hit Sugar Sugar was a charting hit in 26 countries in 1969.
And then he went on to form Hanson.
Honestly, these producers know what they're doing, man.
Yeah. I was just thinking, like, I should take a page out of this book. I don't know the fuck.
Pair a television show, intellectual property, with music produced by studio killers. It ain't a bad call.
And don't cut anybody else in on the merch.
Exactly. Okay. That is the story of Headquarters. Do you guys want to talk about some songs now?
Yeah, I guess we can. Sure.
Let's go right to the vote.
All right, we're going to skip over that opening track. I tried to pick the songs that I actually thought were the best samples, and including one lowlight, of course. And we're going to start off with a song called I'll Spend My Life With You.
Songs were just so middle of the road, just kind of down the middle. Like all of my notes are like, this is inoffensive and fine.
Yeah, same here. Yeah. They're all like almost impossible to talk about because they're so easy to digest and also like empty of content.
I have to admit, I listened a lot because I really wanted to try to understand. And I do think that airy 60s pop is not any of our genres. And it's weighed down by the legacy of the Beatles and things like that and its time. But I do think there's some good songcraft on here. I think this is a well-written song. I think it's a place where something like Peter Tork's banjo actually fits what they're trying to do really well. And I think they're just leaning into their strengths, right? There's that low harmony over the chorus. Again, I think Mickey Dolenz has actually a really good singing voice. He's interesting. He's kind of earthy, not too sweet, but, kind of can still sing pop. There's some great touches to this, actually.
My notes were like, good use of stereo sound. Glockenspiel solo.
It's a Celeste. It's a bell piano that comes in at 131, played by Peter Tork. I think it's lovely. I've always loved the tone of that instrument. It's like a piano with bells instead of strings. It's not that common. I do think we talked about it on the Thelonious Monk Brilliant Corners episode. Also, there's some pedal steel in here that Mike Nesmith plays. Like, I see what they're trying to do. I hear what you guys are saying, that it comes off as a little 60s stock. And I can't really deny that. But I do think there's some nice touches, and I do think they have some successes here.
What I think is a little interesting about this track, and I noticed it on some of the other songs, is like I so heavily associate the Monkees with the Beatles, and it's really, really like on the nose, especially in some of their bigger hits. But this had like a little, this song is a good example of this too. It had a little more of like a California thing, like a Bakersfield, sort of like the Byrds, maybe even like a hint of like the Burrito Brothers sort of vibe. So I was just like a little surprised to hear like more America than I remembered from the Monkees.
The lyrics in the song topic is pretty tacky.
They're also plain, yeah.
Yeah, it's not anything revolutionary, and it doesn't have to be. And I don't hate just a good pop song. Rob, I think to your point about like what they're trying to do, you can hear the inexperience in the studio, certainly. But they are trying. I will give that to them. You're right. This could have had fewer touches to it.
Are they playing everything?
Yeah, except bass.
Except for bass. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes it comes off a little bit like they're trying too hard to show off that they can do all this different stuff. And it seems like some of the stuff is crammed in.
I agree.
This song didn't seem like it was schizophrenic and sort of jumping in between some of these different accoutrements that they add into some of the other songs. So again, I don't hate it. If you were to ask me in a week to sing any line from this song, I would have no concept of what to sing. I'd be like, it's gone. It's gone out of my head.
I hear what you're saying. I really do. And I think there's some nice material here. And I certainly think if you're a fan of light 60s pop music and you haven't heard this, it's worth listening to. But I'm not sure it rises above that level. Because, like you guys are saying, I agree, the sentiments being expressed in the songwriting are pretty stock, and the arrangements do have some nice touches, but you hear that inexperience. I think that inexperience could be charming, except that it's coupled with their sort of mega fame from the show. which creates some cognitive dissonance there, right? Certainly we would be perceiving it differently. Presumably we wouldn't be listening to it at all if they didn't have the show backing them, and if this were just a young band trying to do something in the 60s.
Yeah, agreed. The fact that the other famous musicians who by and large worked their ass off to get where they were, not that I'm saying these guys didn't work their ass off, but it was a different thing. The fact that they all were cool with them shows that they must have been very charming people, because it would have been very easy to be super bitter about that and be like, "Are you fucking kidding me? Like, you have 4 #1 albums and you're not really doing anything for that." Like, I can see why they wanted to prove the haters wrong. Maybe not even in the press, maybe just to feel like they were hanging out with other musicians and they didn't want to feel like total posers the entire time.
Yeah, I could see sort of wanting to prove something to yourself, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're also saying is that there's not a big enough leap. Like this is the problem in the shadow of the Beatles' legacy in particular, is that the Beatles were moving so fast with innovations, musical and otherwise, through genres, into new territory. And so anyone who is even a little bit behind that curve or significantly behind that curve automatically feels dated. And I think that's part of what we're experiencing here. In other words, they were trying to get away from a bubblegum pop image. And actually, I think the dial is turned significantly away from the bubblegum pop of I'm a Believer, for instance. However, they don't turn it nearly as far as the other groups that are more well-known from the era, like the Beatles, and they're suffering from that.
Sure.
Was all coming out. When we were born, we got to hear the best of it, the Simon and Garfunkels, the Beatles, the Stones. And so that's what we're putting this up against. And again, this song's similar. It sounds a lot like As Tears Go By the Rolling Stones.
Definitely.
It's like a template of a song, It's like it's just like here we're learning how to write a song. We're just gonna take these elements and make them very obvious in our approach.
You're saying it's like the old version of like the YouTube jam along tracks where you're just kind of like,
yeah.
Well, to be clear, they did not write this song. This is written by a married couple called Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, who also have a writing credit on You've Lost That Loving Feeling and On Broadway, the Drifters song.
Nice.
I think it's a well-written tune. I think what you're hinting at is the production of it. I think it's cute. I'm a sucker for when bands trade off vocals very noticeably. It gives me this like sense of camaraderie and friendship, and I think that's clearly what they're going for here, right? So I think it's a great little pop song. I agree the sentiment, the lyrics, pretty basic, pretty trite, but I think there's some nice playing on this too. And I think this is an example of where they don't overplay their hand and try to do too much. The piano playing is nice, pedal steel's in there, it's simple, it's nice. Doesn't try to smack you in the face, right?
But it's boring.
Well, it's also mixed kind of terribly, in my opinion. The vocals, the gap between the vocals and the instruments is so stark that you can't really hear a lot of the touches that they're doing instrumentally.
I bet you the guy who mixed it also plays the French horn, because he was like, "Yo, let's turn that horn up, dog. It makes sounds good."
Too much. It gets the intended effect across the friendship and sharing the mic. But he's definitely off. I don't know if they did 50 takes of that and he still couldn't quite get it without croaking.
Yeah. I feel like they were trying to highlight the vocals very heavily in this song. But, like the string arrangements are good. I think it's like pretty okay overall as a song. I don't hate it. I don't love it. But I don't like the way that it's mixed at all. I think that it doesn't gel because there's too much distance between the different parts in terms of volume.
Let's keep things rolling along. The next song on the list is I Can't Get Her Off of My Mind.
I've been standing on the corner all day, trying to think of little things to say, 'cause she walks by every day about this time, and I don't think I'll ever get her off of my mind. Well, I only met her about a week ago.
This one gave me major Herman's Hermits vibe. That's what which is not a compliment.
I think the piano is fun on this song, the piano line. It has a bridge, which I don't think the other songs have a bridge.
So this is my low point. This is my line in the bubblegum sand. It's too goofy. It's too, how much is that doggy in the window? I excluded the complete nonsense tracks from contention as a low point, but looking at the rest of them, I think this is definitely a step backwards. It is a Boyce and Hart song. I think they have written some good songs for the Monkees. They're the ones that wrote Last Train to Clarksville. They wrote the first song we played. They wrote the Monkees theme, all of which I think are pretty nicely constructed. But this is just dopey, and it feels like it's queued up and intentionally overly simple so that Davy Jones can sing it, because he's the one that's the lead singer here. Nothing unexpected happens here.
The tack piano just makes it really silly the whole time. It kind of makes it, it sounds like a theme song to a show or something. Like it should run 30 seconds and, have some visual aid.
Well, the funny thing is, I actually wrote that I think this is the Monkees' lane. That's kind of where I've categorized them as stupid fucking pop songs that mean nothing and are just oh, okay, that's good enough for an episode of TV. Let's move on. And so I was kind of when I heard this song, I wasn't I like it. I was more just oh, there we go. That's the Monkees that I kind of know and sort of think are okay.
I think I've just been, to be clear to the audience and to you guys, I've been trying to make the case for why I think this was included. They were a huge phenomenon. They were trying to do something as a band, as a scrappy young upstart of a band. I do not necessarily think they succeeded. They certainly didn't succeed on every track, right? But I think there are signs of something that if they had continued to water it, could have gone to a really interesting place. And this track to me is just backward looking and not that.
Yeah, fair enough. But sometimes, sometimes you just pull an AC/DC and you're just I'm just going to write the same song for 35 fucking years. And it actually is still kind of great.
I just feel if I brought this song into a band practice and was hey, dude's got a new tune and played the demo, everybody would be pass.
Well, yeah.
I mean, if you brought any of these songs in, I'd be pass.
Okay, let's move. Let's keep it moving. Next song is called For Pete's Sake.
Shine. We were born to love one another. This is something we all need. We were born to love one another. We must be what we're going to be. And the way I could be is free.
This is my high point. Even though it's Taxman, basically.
Yeah, it's Beatles B-side is even the way they produce the vocals, they're trying to make the vocals sound very Beatles-esque too. Yeah,
totally. It's got a good guitar lick in the beginning. I like the "What We Have to Be Is Free" kind of harmony thing they do in that part. It's just got more to pay attention to than a lot of these other songs, in my opinion.
I also listed this as my highlight. I like the rhythm guitar. Listen, Beatles B-side or even C-side is kind of their lane. Let's be honest, right?
I actually said D-side. But
sure, yeah. But you know what I like about this? There's a little tiny shot of darkness in it. Even though the song is definitely maybe not a slam dunk in terms of writing, I think it's good. I want to hear more. I'd like to hear more from the band in this lane. And it's funny that when I first heard it, I thought, oh, this reminds me of the theme song to the Monkees, which is actually one of my favorite Monkees songs.
Oh, it's great.
Also has some similar elements, and then it turns out that this was used as the closing credits theme for the second season. So maybe I already had it wormed into my brain, but
interesting. I felt like there wasn't a whole lot for me to sink my teeth into. This also had a bit of a feel of New York mining accident, 1912, or whatever the hell that Bee Gees song was, Yeah.
All right, fair enough. Well, I think we know where this is going, so let's just talk.
I highlighted this because it just felt like I knew it deep in my bones, even though I didn't.
No, that's because you listened to Maxwell's Silver Hammer and heard that and heard that scat part.
I was gonna say this is very Paul McCartney, late Paul McCartney, Beatles experimentation.
Maybe that's the answer.
It's my favorite song on the album.
I do like it though. I think it shows them stretching their legs in a way that they're unwilling to do on a lot of the other stuff. And it was a hit. This is a number 2 hit in the UK, even though they made the band swap out the title, which they then cheekily called alternate title, because this title translates to horny Liverpool dude.
Yeah. Like I said, I think it's my favorite song on the album. I actually really like the percussive chances that they're taking here. I think that they did a pretty good job of mixing it up, like the weird percussion that they have over, I guess we'll call it the chorus. Like, that's cool. That's a good touch. That seemed to me like they were trying something in a way that I thought was like relatively successful. So I would listen to this song again. I don't exactly know why it was a hit, but I definitely would listen to it again.
Okay. I think perhaps now we've gabbed enough about them, their Monkees. So, time to draw our conclusions. I know we're keeping you on suspense, audience. Is the Monkees headquarters a must listen before you die? Tom, what say you?
No, I'm sorry. I like the story, and I get that they were trying to break away from the chains or the box that they had been put into. Good for them. I don't need to hear this album to understand the music from the 60s because they frankly are aping a lot of the other music from the 60s that I already like and listen to. I don't need to hear their version of it.
I see what you did there with aping.
All right. That's one no vote. Let's pass it on to Marty.
Respect to the members of the Monkees, because they do seem like cool guys and it is a good story. Congrats on all the money they made for only being around for a few years, making tons of dough. Sad that Davy Jones was the non-partier but died first. Poor guy. Life is a bitch.
But he was also the youngest, by the way.
And the youngest. Yeah, well, the Monkees TV show will be featured in the book that I'm writing called 1001 TV Shows to Watch Before You Die. But sadly, this album is not on my 1001 albums you must listen to before you die list.
Okay, all right. Passing the mic to Phil.
Yeah, so I'm gonna follow suit with Tom and Marty here. I'm not too cool for the Monkees. I'm a Believer and Daydream Believer and Last Train to Clarksville and Stepping Stone and Believer's Believer. But this particular record is a pass for me. Maybe there were no Believer songs. Maybe that's why it didn't
That was
click.
the problem, yeah.
But so this is a pass for me.
Okay, well, my vote is now meaningless, but what I have tried to do here is tell this story, which I think is an interesting story, and make the case that I like to think that Robert Dimery was making. That said, I agree with my compadres here. This is absolutely inessential. It's nice. It's 31 minutes long, and if you back out the complete nonsense tracks, you're under 30 minutes on this album. So it's light by any standard. Maybe if they hadn't been so obsessed with pumping out material so fast, this album could have included better songs like Pleasant Valley Sunday or Daydream Believer, which I think are memorable in a way that no single track on this album stands out to me and is super memorable, and that's why it's not a part of their 10 greatest, right? And so while I think the Monkees were a super interesting phenomenon and the show is also worth watching, I would totally agree that the show helps bring across why they were a phenomenon. I don't think you need to listen to this. Sorry, Monkees. Instead, listen to our show. If you're hearing the sound of my sonorous voice, you've already done that. I think that was a better call this time.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. That is that. Unanimous no vote. We're on a little no streak. See how that continues or does not. But first, we're going to go to the old mailbag and read some listener mail. And we have some good ones today. First up, we have Rufus writing from somewhere in Britain. By the way, the listeners have not helped me identify parts of the UK any better. He says, "Hey guys, first off, great show. Your podcasts are amusing, informative, self-deprecating, and even though I don't find myself agreeing with your opinion all the time, I've just finished listening to the Marilyn Manson episode, and in this instance, I do fully agree with the verdict that the album is a load of bullocks. At the end of the aforementioned episode, there was also a discussion related to Marty and his contributions to the podcast. So I thought I would weigh in. Stop the Marty bashing."
Oh, where's their Marty bashing?
All the time when you're not on.
Come on.
In my humble opinion, says the listener, This was not written by Marty. This was written by a real person. In my humble opinion, there are 3 reasons why Marty is a welcome addition to the podcast. He does appear to have previously heard of or even listened to most of the bands or albums that are on the list. I often find myself agreeing with his thoughts more than the other panelists. And thirdly, and most importantly, because of his Beavis and Butthead laugh, which is heard several times an episode. Keep up the good work.
All right.
Nice.
I'll take that.
Take what you can get, man.
I'll take what I can get.
We have one more here. This is from listener Sula. She writes in, "Hello, gentlemen. I've just finished listening to your Ween episode. I've never heard of Ween, but I wanted to find out about them and their music, so I listened in. Utterly, utterly boring. Not only is this music not my cup of tea, but gorgeous voiced Adam," and she puts in parentheses GVA, "hardly speaks in this episode.
Wow.
I kept listening in case there was something I might learn, and lo and behold, the link to SpongeBob SquarePants made it all worthwhile. Anywho, this episode reminded me to send you my tweet-length review of your podcast. Here it is. Recipe for 1001 album complaints. Take 4 to 6 music nerds, add a pinch of Beavis and Butthead, a couple scoops of Wayne's World, a large handful of School Rock, season with some Malcolm in the Middle to taste, sit back, and enjoy." She signs off as Keep Booshin'.
That's so nice.
Nice. Marty, you've been getting some in our Patreon comments as well. People have been giving you some props in the Patreon comments.
Hey, that's great.
Yeah.
Well, if you want to tell us what's on your mind or who you do and don't like on this episode or what you think about their vocal fry or their particular laugh or compare us to 90s cartoons or Saturday Night Live movies, you can do that by simply writing us at 1001albumcomplaints@gmail.com. And now we have but one thing left to do, which is to hand the reins to Tom to tell us what we're going to be listening to this week.
Thank you, Rob. I have the Albinator here, and it said, "Hey, I want to give some creative input." And I said, "Shut the fuck up and get back in the corner." Because we don't need the Albinator this week. As you all probably know, we have thrown it out to the fans for a little fan selection for the next album that we're going to listen to. And I am happy to announce that we will be covering Weezer, a.k.a. the Blue Album by Weezer. That was a pretty squeaker of a vote there, but finally came down on the side of Weezer.
Wait a second. You're trying to suggest that the Teal album, the Blue album, with like fucking My Name is Jonas on it, that didn't make the list.
Did not make the list.
No Weezer records made the list, yeah.
Whereas the Monkees made the list. Okay, the list, yeah.
And Trafalgar. I just want to reference Trafalgar again.
Oh,
D-Light made the list.
That's what we're doing here, guys. We're righting wrongs with these glaring omissions.
Okay, good. All right. Thank you. Sorry.
Yes. So those were Alan's picks, and we are happy to announce that the voting has come in. We're going to be diving into the Blue album and giving that one a few spins this week. I'm looking forward to that. I do love to listen to that album.
Is this Alan from the podcast or Alan from the streets?
Alan Parsons.
Yeah.
He produced Dark Side of the Moon.
Okay.
He wrote that the intro song that the Chicago Bulls come out to. Yeah. You would recognize it if you heard it.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Excited to get into Weezer. Listen along with us.
You didn't answer my question, but okay.
Who else? What other Alan?
Okay, I don't pay attention to a lot of these things.
I know. Okay.
It's Marcus Allen, dude. He's going to bust along. It's going to be sick.
All right. So excited to listen to Weezer this week. Hope you listen along with us, audience, and join us for that next week. For this week, we shall be closing things out now for 1001 Album Complaints. I've been Rob.
I've been Tom.
I'm Marty.
And I am Phil.
Aboosh.